Hi, Michelle Glass here, and welcome to our final episode of Chapter 12, Lecture 12. Our topic here are neurotransmitters, which we've been talking about a little bit now for a few chapters. Neurotransmitters, we know, are communicating chemicals or chemical messengers that are released at synapses, at those chemical synapses. Neurotransmitters can be excitatory, meaning that they can cause depolarization of the postsynaptic cell. To depolarize a cell, you have to trigger the influx of a cation, a positively charged ion. And so typically we see that that's going to be sodium. Neurotransmitters can also inhibit cells, so we can also talk about them as inhibitory, meaning they cause hyperpolarization, which we should remember is the efflux or exit of potassium ions. Now, the thing to keep in mind is that neurotransmitters themselves are not classified as excitatory and inhibitory. Instead, it's dependent on the receptor of that postsynaptic cell. So we can see, for instance, acetylcholine stimulating one cell, but then inhibiting another, depending on the receptor of that cell. So the cell gets to make its own receptors, and in that way, it's determining how it responds to the neurotransmitters that are being released. We've talked a lot about acetylcholine, but there are some other important neurotransmitters. Norepinephrine, which is abbreviated NE, is usually an excitatory neurotransmitter. Dopamine is another example. This is involved or released in the central nervous system. It can be either inhibitory or excitatory depending on the location. So it can prevent the overstimulation of skeletal muscle. So if you do not have dopamine available, then you might get stiff, rigid muscles because they're being overstimulated. We also see that dopamine will excite the brain. If you are not removing it from the synapse, then that's in part how you can get a high from some different types of drugs. Serotonin is another important transmitter that's also released at the CNS. It's involved in concentration and attention and our emotional state. So a lot of times serotonin is involved in depression. Neuromodulators are opioids, which are going to be involved in decreasing pain. And so some of these are gases, such as nitric oxide, which is abbreviated NO. It's going to dilate the smooth muscle of your blood vessels, so it's going to increase blood flow. Carbon monoxide can also act as a neurotransmitter, and so of course this can contribute to the hallucinations that you can see or experience as part of carbon monoxide poisoning. There are different mechanisms of actions for neurotransmitters. So one is the direct method, which is what we've talked about this whole time, where the neurotransmitter itself is binding to a chemically gated channel, causing opening or closing of that channel so that you get movement of ions, typically N. You can get an indirect effect, which is going to use what's called a G protein. And in this case, you start out with the G protein inactive. When the neurotransmitter binds to the receptor, that activates the G protein, which in turn opens up an ion channel and ions move in. So a big part of communication between cells is all about this movement of ions. We can also get an indirect effect with intracellular enzymes. So those gas types of neurotransmitters can diffuse directly across the membrane, and then inside the cell activate enzymes, which can then open up channels and trigger the movement of ions. And that is it for Chapter 12.